This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I spend another hour in conversation with artist Sarah Morris. Sarah was first on the program for episode 51. In that conversation, we spent the hour trying to get inside the head of the noted painter and filmmaker. In contrast, today's conversation is more story time. Sarah shares a number of stories from the span of her career, including her entry into the New York art scene in the late 80s, her time in London during the reign of the YBAs, trying to shoot a sleep-deprived Kate Moss for Vogue, and combating a museum's power play. And now, an art world story time with artist Sarah Morris. Sarah, I appreciate you being willing to get together and talk some more, because I think last time we talked, it was all trying to get inside the mind of Sarah Morris. I think we really didn't have an opportunity to really talk about some of your experiences in the art world. And so I thought it'd be neat to have you share some of that. And so maybe we should start back at the beginning. What was the New York art scene like in 1989?
So when I moved to New York, right out of school, and I was immediately, I moved to New York to be in the Whitney studio program, which was down on Broadway below Canal. What was New York art world like? It was very exciting for me. It seemed very glamorous because, I was arriving from Providence, Rhode Island. It seemed very far off. It was close by. I in the sense that I was in the Whitney program. There were lots of really interesting people who I met really within the first couple weeks of being in New York. And also I had lined up, before I moved to New York, I had lined up a job assisting Jeff Koons, who didn't have a studio then, who was just sort of running his work out of his apartment and from a car in Germany. And so I was sort of working for him and working, and in the Whitney studio program back and forth, which were sort of two, the way I see it now and the way I saw it then was pretty much the same thing. It was two polarities in the art world, one being sort of what I'd call in the thick of the art world, which was sort of working for Jeff and helping him plan and make his Made in Heaven series, which was quite amusing and definitely eye-opening.
Right.
And then the other polarity was the Whitney program, which was being directed by Hal Foster and Ron Clark and Mary Kelly. So it was like two extreme versions of the art world in one day. I literally would bike between the two spots because I had duties to do at Jeff's. Listening to his answering machine was one of them. And I remember Isa Genskin was leaving a lot of messages. I didn't know who Isa Genskin was at the time, but I quickly put it together. I had already met Gerhard Richter when I was a student. I sat next to him at a dinner party in Cologne. He was a professor in Düsseldorf at the time.
Right, the Kunstacademy.
Exactly. So, it was in terms of what New York was like, it was not that dissimilar to what it's like now. There's many different fractions in the art world in New York. They don't always meet. They definitely don't listen to each other. They don't have a lot to do with each other. It's in a way why I really liked being in London when I was in London, because in London you had different fractions and people heading in very different directions, but everybody was at the same table, at the same pub, at the same restaurant, and talking to each other. Mm-hmm. In New York, it was much more fractional and cliquish. But I had an interesting vantage point of being in these two different sort of situations, if you will.
Well, let me ask you this. We talked the first time we spoke about how you went to Brown and you got a major that was a philosophy major, is a lot like poli-sci. When you tell this story, you wind up in the Whitney program, you wind up working with Jeff. How do those opportunities arise for someone who wasn't exactly an art major? Like, how did you get from where you were on the outside to your foot in that door?
Yeah, that's a good question. Looking back, how did I do that? Well, Brown was an interesting place to be when I was there because there were a lot of people who were much older than me who I didn't really know, but I knew by reputation. People like Todd Haynes and Christine Vachon. There was a lot of emphasis on filmmaking. Most of my friends made films. I didn't make films at that time. They were way too expensive. It was totally analog, of course. And I was in other people's films, but I definitely didn't make my own films. What I did do, which was more interesting to me, is I made a manifesto. And I made a manifesto my senior year at Brown. And it was called Defunct. And it was a one-shot sort of publication. Mm-hmm. And we distributed it all over, like at many universities. We distributed it.
Is that like what they would call a zine? Or
it was slicker than a zine. It was very nicely printed in Providence by some, I guess, printer that we found. And it was funded by the semiotics department and the Doyle Center. And that was printed, I guess, I don't know, March or April of 1989. And because of that, for instance, we reviewed one of Hal Foster's books. I'm not sure if I did that or somebody else did that, but I met Hal Foster in that process, and he asked what I was doing the following year. And I actually didn't know. I knew I was moving to New York, and he's the one who sort of told me about the Whitney program and that I should apply. I didn't really know about it till then because, as you pointed out, the sort of school I went to and the things I was studying, there wasn't anybody who I knew who had been in the Whitney program. When I got to New York, it turns out everybody went to the Whitney program. It was like, I didn't realize that people like Jenny Holzer, Julian Schnabel, and all types of various people had gone through that program. It was very small. It was only like 20 people in total. And I was pretty young to get into that. I mean, most people had probably more under their belt in terms of making work. But basically, I had done this manifesto, which I guess they thought was interesting. So that was how I got into the Whitney program. Jeff, both things were actually through the manifesto, because I met Hal through the manifesto, and I also met Jeff through the manifesto. And Jeff had just done his Banality show. I think the Banality show was in November of '88, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so we asked Jeff to do a project in the manifesto, and I met him, and I said to him, not initially, but after a while, I said, what are you working on, and do you need? I think it was like as I was graduating, I said, do you need an assistant? And he actually sort of didn't need an assistant at the time because he was really working in Europe at that time producing stuff there. But he told me about his idea for Made in Heaven and said he would need help organizing everything and coordinating everything and editing everything. So I sort of started basically at the same time as I started the Whitney program. I did that. So how did I organize it? I guess I was pretty, I read everything I could read. When I say that, I mean magazines, journals. I went to a lot of shows. You have to remember, I studied, while I was at Brown, I studied at Cambridge, and I did a program there called SPS, which is Social and Political Sciences, and I was sort of studying Frankfurt School theory with a guy named Graham McCann there. So, I saw shows in London while I was in that program, and I met a number of people. But definitely it seemed like London at the time, ironically, it seemed like, because all of my sort of future friends were still at art school. So London seemed really quiet at the time. I couldn't possibly imagine working there or living there. The Saatchi space was open. I definitely went to go see New York Now. I remember seeing that show. I remember meeting Alan Jones at a party. I remember meeting the Pentagram people. Same party. Mm-hmm. I was lucky that I had a friend who was German who introduced me to a few people, and introduced me to a lot of art that I didn't actually already know, of course. But in terms of my arrival in New York, it was sort of all through the vehicle of the manifesto, really, because I had read so much at school. I really wanted to stop reading, I really just wanted to have a sort of position to figure out how I was going to move forward. That was quite difficult at the Whitney program because they were really emphasizing reading. And it was a little bit complicated, their relationship to sort of making things, so you had these two extremes of like making things versus not making things, and how you were going to position yourself in relation to, let's call it just everything going on. How do you deal with the complicity that we are in?
So it was almost thinking versus action. I mean, do you feel like you're still working from the script, from the manifesto? I mean, has your...
No, I don't feel like that, but I do feel like the problem with Frankfurt School theory, as interesting and as completely topical as it still is, like even more so with, threat of fascism everywhere,
right,
and the industrial sort of, production of culture and what is all around us. I mean, this idea of complicity is something I didn't think was really, I don't think it was really sort of, there wasn't many options as you would read sort of aesthetic theory or read anything that had been written. It was really hard to sort of figure out where to go from reading these texts. And I suppose as I looked at the work of everybody from, like, I don't know, Richard Prince to Louise Lawler to Barbara Kruger to Sherry Levine to Jeff to, I looked at all of these people's work, and it seemed like there was some way to navigate it that was really fascinating to me. And it became clear that was like how I was gravitating towards, going to New York, and I was already seeing lots of shows whenever I could. And if I couldn't see them, I just saw them in magazines. Mm-hmm. A really good friend of mine, a curator in France, Eric Trancy, who I met later in the 90s. I mean, he was curating shows through slides. He was curating shows through, like, not necessarily traveling to New York. I don't think he traveled. I think he had a phobia and wasn't even traveling. He was curating shows through basically sort of dialogue between different dealers and France,
Wow.
and putting together really big shows and having an extremely good eye. I mean, you can do quite a lot with the reproduction. You don't
Sure.
necessarily have to be somewhere. You can, if you read enough and you read enough interviews and whatever, you can figure out quite a lot without necessarily being somewhere or meeting somebody. Of course,
Right.
that takes it to a whole nother level when you do.
I can't even imagine trying to do that in 1990, though. I mean, like today, I can imagine here's my Dropbox, here's an email back and forth. You can see things. But in a world where it's like, mail me your slides and I'll fax you, it just seems like would have been a lot more challenging, right?
Yeah, I don't know how he did it. I think he had like a dialogue with Feature Gallery. He had a dialogue with 303 Gallery. He told me, because I saw him recently in April, and I was like, how did you do that? I remember being really jealous of friends of mine who were in this show that he curated called No Man's Land in the early 90s. And they had never met him. They had never met him. They had never had a studio visit with him. It was all done through correspondence between the galleries that would send him slides. It wasn't even through the artists. It was, and I'm not putting that down in any way. I think it's completely valid to do that. It's interesting. Later on, when I think I did my first show in Paris, I guess I had met him before that. I had visited because the consortium in Dijon was doing and still is doing extremely interesting and topical shows. And they've been doing it for 25 years straight. It's sort of unbelievable how they've operated. And they really haven't put a privilege on the idea of traveling either. They're extremely local, but somehow managed to be right in the center. That sort of fascinated me. But in terms of, do I still think I'm going between different polarities? Definitely. And I don't think, the art world was much smaller then, of course. It seemed much more quaint than it does now. It's sort of expanded and splintered, and it's much larger. And the art fair, all of these things have sort of expanded the sort of width and breadth of the art worlds. But it was much smaller then. But there were still great shows. I mean, the New Museum. I remember New Museum when it was on Broadway. I remember all the shows that Lisa Phillips curated at the Whitney, which were great. Uptown. It was really, it was extremely sort of, it seemed really large at the time to me, even though now, of course, I look back and it was looks like a fraction of the way the art world looks now.
You become part of the art world. You have an entry point. You start making relationships. And so where did you start making relationships? Was it in the Whitney program, or was it just a matter of whose studio was in the same building or showing up at shows? Who did you run into, Sarah?
Well, I remember meeting it was sort of all of the above. There were a lot of people who I met through Jeff. I remember meeting Rob Pruitt, who worked at Sonnabend Gallery. I remember meeting Ashley Bickerton. I remember meeting Rick Ritt and Gavin Brown. They had been in the Whitney program the year or two before me. I mean, it was a pretty small scene. You'd go to an opening and you'd meet everybody. And there was a lot, everybody worked for somebody else pretty much. And that there was sort of an economy that was sort of traceable. I remember the first proper studio I had was on 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues. It was in a building that was featured in Slaves of New York. It was supposedly Andy Warhol's favorite building. Hard to believe, but anyway, I was told that. I had a studio there at 233 West 42nd. That was my first studio. And, Jack Pearson was in the building. Rita Ackerman came into the building because of me. There was Christian Marclay, I think, was on the top floor. And we started curating shows and doing a series of group shows that I curated called Close Up, which one was a group show of a number of British artists that we had met. And then we did these sort of small solo shows. I mean, it was a tiny space. I mean, it was like we got the space, I think, for free from the landlord. You have to remember that whole block was slotted to be cleaned up by Giuliani. So like the rents were tiny, and it was possible to do something like that in Midtown Manhattan. And so because of that, several of us were in the Venice Biennale. Some people got show offers, and then also the British artists that we put into the show that was curated, they invited us to be in a show called Lucky Kunst on Silver Place in London. And that was like, I guess, 93. Mm-hmm. So that was like the first time I went to London to be in a show. And that was organized by Gregor Muir, who's now at the Tate, and Gary Hume, Jane Louise Wilson, Sam Teller-Wood, number of other people. And it was extremely fun. That was the first sort of taste of London from a very different perspective.
Sure.
Than I had seen it before.
So I guess you had visibility to the whole YBA, young British artist movement that was going on at Goldsmiths then, right? I mean, a lot of those names are kind of the names that we think of as making that scene happen. Mm-hmm. Did you make it by Goldsmiths and, get that local to the scene, or was it always at the show?
Absolutely. No, definitely. When I did my first show at White Cube, which was 1996, I definitely was asked to do like a talk at Goldsmiths. I definitely had met Michael Craig Martin already. And it's interesting to me that all those kids were taught by an American.
Right.
I'm not being nationalistic. It was just like a different, Michael was like very important that, he was teaching, he was still teaching then, even though they had all left years before, but he was still teaching. And it was interesting to me that he was taught that, they were all taught by an American. There was a sort of rationalism to the way they approached, why not? Why can't you do this? Like, why can't you organize a show and sell it to Charles Saatchi? Why can't you, a lot of Damien's thinking came from this sort of Americanism of Michael's. That was very obvious to me. But yeah, of course, I even probably visited the studios of Goldsmiths a couple of times to meet some of the graduate students there. So yeah, I was very aware of it.
Let me ask you this. Let's imagine Julian Schnabel is making a Hollywood feature about Sarah Morris. What are some of the most fascinating scenes that have to be in the movie? Because, we think of Schnabel's like depiction of Basquiat, he had to include that scene of Basquiat, trying to sell postcards to Andy Warhol, right? Like what are some of those iconic scenes in your movie?
Wow. Oh my God. I mean, I don't even know where to start. There's so many scenes.
Right.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I mean, some of the things I don't even know if it's like okay to say. One scene for sure would be when I was asked by British Vogue to come up with an idea for Kate Moss to do something with her for the magazine. That was definitely a situation, a scene.
Right.
I had a studio in Berlin by that point because I was in the American Academy in Berlin, which was the first year that they had invited 2 artists to be there. And it was me and Jenny Holzer. And Jenny Holzer didn't have a studio, though. I had a studio at the Künstlerhaus Battagnen. Anyway, British Vogue asked me to do a project with Kate Moss. By this point, they were treating me as if I was a YBA. That was also quite strange because I'm British and American, right? I have 2 passports.
Right.
So this was sort of useful. Of course, everybody thought of me as completely American, but not Vogue, which thought of me as British, not the Tate, which thinks of me as British. And a lot of people think of me as British. I am technically British because I was born there,
right.
but I was raised here. But I think of myself as American. But anyway, I really loved the work of Richard Hamilton, so I was really interested in really what he did with the White Album and the whole idea of packaging and industrial design. So what I proposed to do with Kate Moss is what anybody would propose to do with her, which is just like shoot the cover and shoot the May issue of the cover. So they arranged it. I said what I wanted to have, the backdrop.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, I didn't specify any clothes. It's a fashion magazine. I didn't ask for any clothes to be delivered, nothing, right? Because I was just going to bring it myself. I was going to put her in a bathing suit of mine. And they flew me back from Berlin to do this cover shoot. And that morning, I think I heard that the shoot was really delayed by like 2 or 3 hours. And it even sounded like, it might not even happen. And I was like, I was in the middle of working on a show for Zurich, for Kunsthalle Zurich. And I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. Like I've flown all the way back to London and it sounds like it might not even happen. It sounded like they couldn't reach her. Anyway, I immediately say that I've flown back just to do this. We've got to do it. This is my only opportunity to do it is this day. And I was really excited to get it over with and nervous and excited to get it over with. So I go to the studio somewhere in the East End and Kate shows up, had been out all night the night before. Her eyes were like incredibly bloodshot, like an albino rabbit. And I'm thinking, wow, like this is going to be a great photo.
Right.
And as we're getting her prepared and I'm like doing her makeup or I'm directing the makeup artist what to do with her. And she's getting into this bathing suit that it was like a vintage bathing suit that I had bought in the East Village that had been made into like a shirt.
Wow.
It had been made into like a tube top type thing.
I see.
And I brought the bathing suit, I brought a Coke cup, and I asked for this pink backdrop, and I was sort of thinking of like spring, summer, as if she's driving in a car and she'll be sipping this Coca-Cola. And Nick Knight comes upstairs to the studio, pops his head in. I had met him already through Peter Saville, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I think I'm shooting the May cover for British Vogue. And he said, well, that's really funny because they told me I was shooting the cover for the May issue.
Oh, boy.
And I was like, oh. And I remember feeling like I had made some faux pas, or maybe he had made a faux pas. I didn't really know what was going on. Anyway, he was just starting a platform at the time, like a digital platform, which actually I had titled. and it was called Show Studio. He didn't know what to title it. And I said, you should call it Show. And he and Peter Saville used to work together a lot. So, and Peter, I had asked to do a catalog of mine, my first catalog, which was for a show I did at Museum of Modern Art, Oxford. And Peter had designed it. So I had met Nick a number of times. Anyway, so Nick leaves the studio, and then we have Kate. And, you know, she had been out all night with, I don't know, Oasis or whoever she was out all night with. It was like, you know, I was hearing the stories, but I didn't really know the first names so well. But I was trying to follow what was going on. And we did the shot. And let me just say this, that the pink in the background, which was like, you know, a really bright, intense pink like I use in my paintings, pretty much matched the whites of her eyes. Like the amount of touch-up we had to do, or I had to go to a special place in London to handle the touch-up on the photo. But the photos came out great. And I ended up...
I'm looking at an image of it right now.
Yeah. I ended up getting the cover, which, by the way, that day I had no idea because Nick Knight popping his head in, like Stellar Street, which was this comedy show in England at the time where, like, every single pop star lived on the same block. And they all went into this, like, deli and hung out in this, like, little delicatessen and sort of gossiped and whatever. It was London was a little bit like that. So anyway, I shot the cover and it all worked out, but like the original photos are really extreme, much more extreme than the actual photo that ran. And of course they placed a bar, you can see a computer barcode over the bit of the bikini, the bit of the bathing suit rather, that made it clear that it was very vintage. Like, I think they said it was Dolce & Gabbana. And the art director of Vogue told me afterwards, you know, you had very little chances of getting on the cover without shooting any fashion. He said, you know, like, actually, you know, but it was a great cover because it really was like, it looked really edgy. It was very edgy. And definitely the scenario in which we shot, you know, at any moment, it felt like the whole shoot was going to fall apart just because the talent had been up all night.
And you know, she always appeared so young. I mean, and for a good part of her career, she was really young, right? But you know, when I look at the picture, you know, it's giving off these Lolita vibes, right?
Yeah.
And so, and her eyes the whites of her eyes are very white. So.
Yeah, well, because it's like there's somebody who only did touch up on her, like by British Vogue, and that guy knew how to do everything. But I was present at the, you know, all the retouch I was there for. But that was a really great scene that then morphed into a scene at the Groucho Club with Marianne Faithfull. One night. We were all there. This is maybe after I finished the year in Berlin, and I had been to a play that night, and actually Marianne Faithfull was at the play. And then we went afterwards to the Groucho Club. And you have to remember, like, everybody was in the Groucho Club. It was like artists, media people, musicians. I mean, it was very common to run into, you know, Blur,
right,
Jarvis Cocker, David Bowie, all in the same night. You know, it was like, and I remember being at the bar with Marianne Faithfull, who I realized something about her, which I can't say definitely publicly, but she was definitely an enabler for some of those people. Anyway, I was talking to her. That's not what was interesting to me about her. What was interesting to me about her is I had read a biography about a dealer in London in the 60s who was sort of the hub of London, who showed Richard Hamilton, and he's the one who got the Beatles involved. And he was sort of the original reason why I believe Richard Hamilton and the Beatles worked together. His name was Bob. I forget his last name. Oh, yeah, Robert Fraser.
Yes.
So there's a book about swinging London. So ironically, I'm in Groucho Club talking to Marian Faithfull at the bar. We're trying to get served. And I was able to ask her about him and about, she was also very involved in this interface between music, art, graphic design, Peter Blake,
Right.
I mean, all of those people sort of converged around Robert Fraser's gallery in the late 60s. And anyway, her voice and her interview is throughout that entire book. And I that night I remember asking her about that portrait of Robert Fraser, and she said to me that I was the only person who had ever asked her about that book, and had read it.
Wow.
And but it's a great book, really great book if you want to understand really the beginnings of London art world, because there was a beginning, then it stopped, then it started again around the time, a little bit before the time I got to London.
Yeah, I mean, I found an article here on Sotheby's site that is talking about how Richard Hamilton, Robert Fraser, Peter Blake, how those iconic Beatles albums there at the end of the 60s were, all kind of connected to the art world. And so...
And London was like that then, like in the sense of, I'm just mentioning the cover of British Vogue just because that would be unheard of in America at the same time. The merging of these different fields, which seem to be far apart, which are actually socially not far apart, but theoretically they're not far apart at all. They're all the same. They're all like, it doesn't really matter if you're a musician versus an artist versus a writer versus some form of talent. You still have a way of navigating and a way of presenting yourself and a way of seeing the world. And somehow that had already been synthesized in London. It was normal to be at a party and have all of those elements in one room. Whereas New York, it was still quite disparate, even though you would think that would already have happened in New York, especially in the 80s. But it wasn't. It didn't seem like that. It was more rarefied in New York.
Had there been some of that during Studio 54, or was it just...
Yeah, maybe there was some of that at one point. Maybe there was, but I'm talking about the connection of somebody. I mean, obviously, I'm sure people did album covers, and
so maybe the concept of Madison Avenue wanting to be in collaboration with the art world, that just wasn't.
Yeah, now it's sort of standard. Now it's normal to have all of these elements mixing around, and it's almost too professionalized, right? I mean, you're not necessarily being asked by, there's people who are, the art fairs have blown this out to some extent, in terms of every single vodka is now trying to be like Absolute Vodka. I mean, if you look back, Absolute Vodka did that campaign. That had to have been early 80s.
I think so.
That campaign of using artists.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, bizarrely, London seemed ahead of New York, even though the ideas seemed to come from New York.
I wonder what that's about. Is it just the close proximity, of?
I think it's the drinking. I think it's the drinking. It's the fraternization. Let's use that word. Between people and what goes on. I mean, I remember there was a guy in London in the mid-90s who had worked for John Lennon. He had been John Lennon's personal secretary. And that guy, I forget his name. I do know, I remember his name. His name is Anthony Fawcett. He used to sponsor all of the openings with Beck's beer. And the Beck's beer was the lubricant, literally, for having long, long evenings, where people would really tell you what they thought.
Right.
But, that wasn't necessarily going on in New York. It was more staid for a while in New York. And it was more professional, more professionalized than this sort of raucous party, everybody's on the same bus thing that was going on in London, which was a lot of fun. I mean, it was like, there was an opening every single night. There was a party going on all the time. It's pretty hard to think of like one scene. The Marianne Faithfull night was a fun night. There's so many sort of instances of, where you realize how things transpired. I mean, I did end up going and visiting Richard Hamilton's studio at one point because I curated a show for Max Hetzler in, I guess it was 98, something like that. It was called Hospital. Mm-hmm. And I asked Richard Hamilton to put his computer, because he had designed a computer, not just like aestheticized a computer. He had designed a mainframe. He had designed the software for this computer called a Diab S100 or 101 or something like that. And I went out to convince him to put this in the show. He really wanted to use like a new monitor on the computer system. But the original one was this, he had painted it with this Porsche gray paint, paint from Porsche. And he didn't see why I wanted the original. He wasn't really interested in the original, you see.
Right.
And I remember he was in a fight at the time with the Tate because he wanted to remake a work and they didn't want it remade. He sort of thought like that. But that was super interesting to see his studio. That was like a really important moment for me.
So any other scenes that we need to make sure are in the movie?
Oh, yeah. The other scene, see, a lot of the really good scenes involve some level of conflict with others.
Oh.
So, I mean, there would be a scene where I'm leaving the LVMH museum and shouting and telling them that I wanted to cancel. They had commissioned me to make a film. Mm-hmm. And the film, I told them right from the beginning, the film was going to be a portrait of Bernard Arnault. The film was going to be the series of corporations that he bought that somehow signified the national, like France, right? Whether it's champagne or perfume or, that basically I was going to get into all the factories and I was going to make a chain that was, the chain becomes the man.
Right.
Right. It was going to be like my version of like Orson Welles,
Citizen Kane, right.
Citizen Kane, right? And the curator at the time had said that that's a fantastic idea, but I can't help you. And I was like, I don't understand. What do you mean you can't help me? You work with these people, like I was puzzled. And she said, yeah, but politically, it's like too complicated. Like you're going to be on your own. And I was like, okay, that's very strange. Right. You've told me I could do whatever I want. I'm doing this idea. Like it could be much easier if you help me. Anyway, it turns out I had to go about it all on my own. And like, so if I wanted to get into the Dior perfume factory, I had to like meet the president of Dior perfume and convince them that I should be in the factory, which has never been filmed before, that produces 30 million little bottles. The bottles are produced in France. The perfume is produced in France. The flowers come from France. I mean, every single element of that product, except probably the cellophane, is made in France.
Right.
Anyway, I had finished the film, and the museum was just about to open, and it was like a Frank Gehry museum. He had designed the museum, and I had gone over. I'd been flown over for the opening of the show, and there was a lot of tension about my film because it went, not because of any of the images. The images are beautiful. It was more like the film went very close to the identity of the brand, right? And they were a little concerned that maybe it would confuse what is art and what is brand. That was the whole point of my film,
Right.
was to confuse it, right? But they were a little concerned about this. So I got there. There had been a lot of tension before I flew over. While I was editing it, there was a lot of tension. Legal tension is all I can say. And then I got there, and one of the junior curators said, "Don't get really upset." They brought me down to this huge room where we were going to install the film. The film is called Strange Magic. Mm-hmm. And the room was amazing. And I was almost like, is this a trick? Because like everything had worked out perfectly. And I was like very, very happy. And then this junior curator said to me on the escalators as we were leaving, "Don't get angry, but they're going to ask you to have a meeting." And that's all I can say. And I knew that this was like a really bad sign. And they took me to a room. The room had no windows. And they opened up what I'm just going to, it looked like a Dell laptop. And they were like, "Could you sit down, and we want you to see your film." And I said, "What is that over there, that door?" They said, "Oh, that's an elevator. That's like a special elevator that Frank Gehry designed that's in the central core of the building." And I said, I just sort of walked out. I said, "There's no way I'm going to watch I've just been editing for like 7 weeks. There's no way I'm going to watch it again." I said, what do you need clarification on at this stage? What do you need? It speaks for itself, but out of curiosity, what do you need to see? Or what do you need to hear from me? And they said, "Well, we don't understand." There was a whole scene leading up to the Dior factory shots with flowers. And they were like, and it's in Provence. It's where they make this stuff called concrete. Mm-hmm. But it's the concrete of perfume, and it's sold for it's sold for thousands and thousands of euros per kilogram. And it's the stuff that they make, it's the stuff that they make the perfume from. Anyway, they said, "We don't understand the flower scenes." And I said, "I'm done. I'm finished." But my voice was not the way I'm speaking now. I think I really raised my voice. And anyway, I marched out of the museum, and they marched. They were running sort of with me, and ironically, we're passing an Izagenskin piece, going back to Jeff's answering machine. And there was this big Izagenskin piece, which was a rose. And I said, "Why don't you ask Izagenskin what her piece means? Why don't you do that?" And I just said, I was really exhausted too. I was absolutely, completely exhausted and jet lagged. And I said, "That's it. Like, I'm not going to change anything," because they were suggesting that I continue editing in France. They wanted something out. They didn't get to the part where they said what they wanted to have out because I didn't let them. I just left the museum and disappeared for about 3 days. And what was really strange is they didn't know which hotel I was in Paris because another group was paying for me. But that night, they've managed to figure out which hotel I was staying at. And that night there was a knock. I told the hotel, "Don't let any calls come through or, anything. I don't want to hear from anybody." Anyway, that night there was a knock on my door, and they brought up a little bag from the curator. And she had sent me some of the Dior perfume. So it was almost like an ironic, winky ticky tack of like, I mean, she understood what it was. I mean, they completely understood it. It was all like a ruse to make me explain the film. And what was funny is I had an assistant who actually used to manage the whole studio, who had gone to work for Grand Theft Auto. Mm-hmm. And I loved this assistant. I was really sad to lose her. And she went to go work for Grand Theft Auto, and she said, it's exactly like working for you, Sarah. We go into a place, we check it all out, we see exactly how it works, we move through it, we navigate through it, we basically make it ours. Anyway, I called her when I had this problem, and I said, what do I do? Because I need some legal help. And she put me in touch with this guy who was a lawyer who I've never met to this day. Mm-hmm. I never got a bill from him to this day, but he's the lawyer for Grand Theft Auto. And he told me exactly what to say, which is, under no circumstances am I going to explain the meaning of this work to you, but I'll be happy to come back and install the work. Anyway, they did invite me to come install the work and finish it. And there was never anything more said about roses and the meaning of flowers in relation to LVMH.
Wow.
But it was a pretty tense few days.
That's really interesting. I mean, it reminds me, like in the used car business, they have something called the silent walk around, where you want to trade in your car. They say, okay, let's go look at your car. And they would just walk around and let you volunteer everything you're self-conscious about with the car you're trading in. Oh, well, that's where my kid, banged its soccer ball. And every time you say something, it devalues the asset that you're trading in, right? And so it's like they were inviting you to give them some opening to say, well, you yourself said this is what it is, and we don't agree with that, right? And so,
well, their whole thing was like, what do these brands have to do with the museum? And my whole thing was like, well, they're literally the concrete of the museum. They are the capital of the museum. So why are you shame? Why is there any shame about it? It's actually really fascinating. These are all almost, these are sort of alchemical processes capitalized. Mm-hmm. They're not even, you can't really have a patent on how to make champagne. It's like an extremely old process. And the same with making a perfume from a flower. Mm-hmm. These processes have existed for centuries. But there was almost this slight farcical, like steroidic farcical sort of conversation about what is the meaning of this, and I just wasn't going to get sucked into it. And I was really exhausted. And I knew through the junior curator, I knew that they said, they did say at one point, why don't you just do a little bit more editing, or why don't you just take out this one scene, or we don't understand it, is what the ruse was, is we don't understand it. They understood it perfectly. And what's funny is when I re-entered the museum 3 days later, bizarrely, I don't know if this was staged or scripted or controlled, but I re-entered the museum, and the Minister of Culture was in the room, who I believe was Chinese. Not making this up. Okay. And Pharrell was in the room, and Arnaud was in the room.
Wow.
And all three of them loved the piece and asked me how I shot this and how I shot that. And of course, I wasn't going to tell them how I shot champagne. Right. Like, it's actually really, it's actually like very, very simple how we were shooting. It was just, we shot the scene they wanted to know about. I shot on my hotel terrace in the sunlight, but it looks like we're in the glass. It looks like we're sort of intoxicated, and we're actually in the glass of the champagne, as it's sort of bubbling after it just got opened. But
so maybe so it's what's interesting in the story is that maybe the curators were more concerned about how Arnaud was going to respond than,
Yes, it was projected. It was like a projected. And this isn't the first time I've had this with curators. It can happen. It happened with the Robert Town. I'll tell you a great story about Robert Town. If I haven't already told you this, when I did the Robert Town painting at Lever House, the curator then was super concerned about the name Robert Town. I think I did tell you this in the last episode. No?
Tell me again, even if you did.
All right. Well, you'll have to check it out because this could be.
No
I do repeat myself, and I've always done this. It's not a sign of old age. It's actually like Anton Karen calls me Johnny 2 times because I always repeat. I've always repeated myself. But anyhow, so they said I titled the piece Robert Town, and they were like, "You have to get this cleared by Robert Town himself." And I said, "You must be kidding me. This is a fake name, And I had to call Robert Town and get it cleared. And that's, it was sort of this litigious fantasy of the curator that made me do this act, which then I have to be thankful for, because calling him led to a friendship and led to a film that I made several months later. Because while I was on the phone with him, I said, I was sad that he wasn't in the Los Angeles film, and I'd like to make a film with him.
Right.
And would he be up for that? And he said yes. So, but you often get this with curators, is that, they get anxious, they get nervous, understandably, but not to take any of this. Your job as an artist is to push through and get what you need to get done. And, take no prisoners.
Right.
And you really have to, I guess that's one thing about being an artist that people don't fully understand. They have this idea that it's maybe easy, or that it's fun, or that it's glamorous, or I don't know. They sort of have this good times image. And of course, there are many of those moments, where it is a lot of fun and you can't believe you're actually doing this as a paid way of living. It's like a dream. But on the other side of that is the fact that you're really in it alone, and you have to have quite a lot of you have to have a lot of willpower, and you have to have a lot of direction, and you have to be able to answer back when people give you a hard time, whether it's a curator or dealer or anybody, really. You have to be able to sort of hold your own in a lot of situations. And that's like that vision that you have in your mind of how you want something to be, to actually get that to be realized, and to get you need other people's help to get that realized. It's not just a solipsistic act. You need a number of people to get it realized, to get your vision realized in the studio and outside the studio, institutionally, professionally. You need a lot of people to help you, and you have to be able to sort of communicate that. And sometimes, people want to weigh in and stop you, or say you're wrong, or they see it a different way. And it's quite complicated, the process, that dance of getting something actually to the final stretch is difficult.
Sure.
Not always, but it can be.
I was talking to somebody recently about what determines success in the art world and what's most important. And doing good work kind of goes without saying, but pushback was that, being talented in doing good work a lot of times isn't enough in the art world, and that there are other things at play. I think your work kind of stands out as being exceptional, but what is it beyond just the good work you've done that's afforded you the success?
That's very nice of you to say. Well, I never really feel like anything is finished or anything is like accomplished. I mean, of course, I mean, that might be partly fiction, because obviously when I'm putting together a big show like the one for the Dijkterhallen, which is this retrospective coming up next year, obviously I do see a huge amount of activity that I can call sort of done, but I don't really view it as like a finished thing. There's still lots more to do. So I don't really view it as, I don't really, I guess I've never really felt like I know it must look like a different thing from the outside, but I don't really feel like I'm on the inside. I feel like I'm, I've always straddled this, and it might be because of, the way I was educated. Maybe it could be because I'm dual national. It could be because of gender. I'm not really sure what it's because of, but I don't really view that I'm like on the inside. I don't view it like that. I view it like you're constantly trying to get your work done. It's always a struggle. It's always difficult. There's always things in your way. There's always obstacles. There's always problems. It could be viewed as the definition of making art. There's always problems going on. So I don't really view it as, I guess I just, maybe it's my viewpoint is I just don't see it as, I still feel the same way as I felt when my studio was on 42nd Street. I try to hold on to that on purpose. But the way I, even the way I'm reading the news or the way I'm, watching what's going on in the art world, I try to keep a critical distance. I try. Not saying I'm always successful doing that, but I try to.
Well, one last question. I was speaking with somebody recently who's a collector, and I mentioned you, and they said, "Oh yeah, Sarah Morris, the painter." Do you feel like you struggle to earn the same sort of respect for your films that people have for paintings? I mean, do you feel like there's different levels of appreciation in the art world based on the different types of media?
I think that's an interesting question. There's many different audiences in the art world or in the world in general. And I don't have a problem with most of them. There's some people who look at the work, they just see the paintings. There's some people who look at the work who just see the titles. There's some people who look at the work who only see the films. So I'm never really struggling between these two things. I think I said before that, like, it's almost like having a right hand and a left hand. To me, it's all part of me. If somebody's complimenting one thing, I'm not like wondering about the other thing. It's like it's all me. However, there's a lot of work, and I think I said before, it could be the work of 2 or 3 people, but it's not. It's the work of one person, and that's fine. And people will always privilege certain parts of it, depending on who they are. They'll always privilege one thing over another. I don't feel in any way like one thing is stronger than the other, or more seen. I think that I've been very lucky that right from the beginning, I've had my gallery's support and also the curators who I have been involved with. Even if it's been tricky, I've had their support to show both. So, and also to do these like quite unusual projects, which I love, like shooting the cover of a magazine or designing, I was asked last week, the last couple of days, I've been designing a box for a very famous cake. I mean, I bet you didn't expect that sentence. So there's a special cake in Austria from a very special hotel called the Hotel Soccer.
Right.
And they make this cake, and it comes in a little wooden box. And my gallery in Vienna always sent me one of these cakes at Christmas time, so I'm quite familiar with these cakes. Anyway, the Hotel Soccer they do every couple of years, they ask an artist to design and do a special edition of the box for charity. And I was just doing that.
So it's almost like a BMW art car, but it's a cake box.
But it's a chocolate cake. Yeah. I save those boxes. I'm the type of person who saves the boxes of the cakes and then puts brownies in them. I love projects like that. I like when art it's obviously a pretty simple idea. You can see it in relation to the 80s, but you can also see it in relation to Bauhaus, that art should be useful. Art should be everywhere. Why not? Because it's better.
Right.
I mean, it's just like it's if you can improve something, why not? Why not do that?
Well, Sarah, I really appreciate you being willing to sit down for a second hour to have story time. You're a fascinating listen, and I really appreciate your generosity of your time, and thanks for being open.
Yeah, well, my pleasure.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.